Welcome back to Phoenix Podcast, hosted by Amin Moeinian, where we deep dive into politics and economics and explore the philosophies and histories behind today's challenges. You ready to explore something that's been hitting everyone's wallets lately? We're talking inflation, but we're going beyond those price tags you see going up at the grocery store.
Absolutely. Inflation is a bit of a chameleon. It can blend into the background, but has a huge impact. We're going to peel back the layers and see how it can actually shift wealth around in ways you might not expect.
Okay, let's unpack this. We often hear inflation measured by the Consumer Price Index, the CPI, that basket of goods they track. But is that the whole story? I mean, does it capture everything that's going on?
The CPI is like a thermometer. It gives us a temperature reading, but it doesn't tell us why someone is running a fever. It shows us prices are rising, but not the deeper reasons driving those changes.
So it's a piece of the puzzle, but not the entire picture. What are we missing when we only focus on the CPI?
We miss the core concept of how money itself works in an economy. Think of it like this. Imagine you have a limited number of concert tickets, and suddenly everyone has more money to spend. Those tickets become more valuable, not because the concert itself changed, but because there's more money chasing the same limited supply.
So the value of the tickets is relative to how much money is out there. It's not that the tickets themselves are better.
Exactly. And this brings us to a key insight from the Austrian School of Economics. They emphasize that inflation isn't just about prices going up, it's about an increase in the money supply relative to the goods and services available.
Okay, so more money chasing the same amount of stuff. But how does that actually redistribute wealth? That's the part that's really intriguing.
Let's stick with our concert ticket example. Imagine some people get that extra money before everyone else. They can buy those tickets at the original price before the rush. Suddenly, they've got something valuable that others have to pay more for or can't even get at all.
So those who get the new money first have an advantage. It's like they're getting a head start in a race.
Exactly. And this is where things get a little uncomfortable because it often means those who already have more resources tend to benefit most from this process. Think about those with access to loans or investments. They can use that new money to acquire assets like real estate or stocks before prices skyrocket for everyone else.
So inflation can actually widen the gap between the haves and have-nots.
That's right. And that brings us to the concept of economic conflict that emerges during inflation. It's not always violent or obvious, but it's this underlying tension where some gain at the expense of others.
And who usually ends up on the losing end of this economic tug-of-war?
Think about people on fixed incomes, like retirees or those whose wages don't rise as quickly as prices. Their buying power is diminished. They're effectively being priced out of things they could afford before. This is a point often raised by classical liberals who advocate for individual economic freedom. They argue that inflation disproportionately harms those who are least able to protect themselves.
So we're not just talking about a temporary pinch. It's a fundamental shift in their ability to participate in the economy. What about the long-term consequences? Is it just that immediate hit to income?
Unfortunately, it goes much deeper. Imagine you're trying to save for a down payment on a house, but the money you're putting aside is losing value faster than you can save. Or think about small business owners who can't raise prices to keep up with costs. Eventually, they might be forced to close.
So it's not just about making ends meet today. It's about your ability to build a future, to invest, to grow.
Exactly. Inflation erodes those possibilities. And this is a key point. Any discussion about inflation that only focuses on prices misses the crucial point of how it impacts individual opportunities and overall economic mobility.
This makes me think about something Amin Moeinian has been highlighting. He talks about how focusing solely on controlling prices without tackling the root of the problem is like treating a symptom without addressing the underlying disease.
That's a great way to put it. And it leads us to this concept of a mirage of social justice. Policies that only try to manage prices might create an illusion of fairness on the surface, but they don't address the deeper inequalities created by the initial redistribution.
So it's like putting a bandage on a wound that needs stitches.
Precisely. And what's interesting is that this mirage can be appealing to those who benefit from the initial redistribution. It masks the underlying power dynamics at play.
It's like those who got the concert tickets early are happy to see measures that keep the price of those tickets down, even though they were the ones who benefited from the initial price hike.
Exactly. It allows them to maintain their advantage while appearing to support fairness.
That's a really insightful way to think about it. So if the CPI isn't the whole story and this redistribution is happening behind the scenes, what's the real situation in developed nations like Canada? Are we truly in control of inflation, or are we just postponing the consequences?
That's the million-dollar question. There's a concept called a Minsky moment, named after economist Hyman Minsky, which describes a sudden collapse in asset values after a prolonged period of growth fueled by debt and speculation.
So are you suggesting that hidden or unaddressed inflation could eventually lead to a Minsky moment, like a bubble bursting?
It's a possibility worth considering. If the true cost of capital is distorted by inflation, it can lead to excessive risk-taking, driving up asset prices beyond their real value. Eventually, something triggers a loss of confidence, and the whole thing comes crashing down.
That's a sobering thought. It really makes you wonder if we're paying enough attention to the underlying causes of inflation, or if we're just setting ourselves up for trouble down the road.
It highlights how important it is to understand the true nature of inflation and its potential consequences. We can't just look at rising prices. We have to consider the broader systemic factors at play.
I think that's a key takeaway from our discussion so far. Inflation is much more than just numbers on a price tag. It's a complex phenomenon with far-reaching implications for individuals, businesses, and entire economies. And it's something we'll continue exploring right after this break.
Welcome back to Phoenix Podcast, where we're deep diving into the intricate world of inflation. Before the break, we were unpacking how inflation can be like a hidden current shifting wealth and influencing economic landscapes.
We were also talking about how focusing solely on price controls, like putting a cap on how much things can cost, might seem like a quick fix, but it doesn't actually address the root cause of the problem.
Exactly, and that's where this idea of the mirage of social justice comes into play. When governments try to control prices without addressing the underlying reasons for inflation, they might create a temporary illusion of fairness.
So it's like putting a Band-Aid on a broken bone. It might look better on the surface, but it doesn't actually solve the problem.
Precisely. It's like trying to hold back the tide with a sandcastle. Eventually, those underlying forces are going to break through, and often, those who are most vulnerable end up bearing the brunt of the consequences.
You mentioned earlier that those on fixed incomes, like retirees or people whose wages don't rise as quickly as prices, are particularly impacted by inflation. Can you elaborate on that a bit more?
Think about it this way. Imagine someone retired 20 years ago and had a comfortable nest egg saved up, but over time, as prices have risen, the purchasing power of that nest egg has diminished. What they could once afford might now be out of reach. It's like their savings have slowly been leaking away.
So it's not just about prices going up, it's about the value of their hard-earned money eroding over time. That must be incredibly frustrating for people who have worked and saved their entire lives.
It is, and this brings us to another crucial point that Amin Moeinian often brings up: the impact of inflation on entrepreneurship and economic growth. When inflation is high, it creates uncertainty and makes it much riskier to start a business.
Because you don't know if the prices of the materials you need are going to skyrocket next week, or if people will still be able to afford your product or service.
Exactly. That uncertainty can make it really difficult for small businesses to plan for the future, invest in growth, or even just stay afloat. And when entrepreneurship is stifled, it hurts the entire economy. Fewer new businesses mean fewer job opportunities, less innovation, and ultimately slower economic growth.
So it's a domino effect. Inflation can impact individuals, small businesses, and ultimately the entire economic ecosystem. But what about policy solutions? Are there things governments can do to address the root causes of inflation and mitigate its negative effects?
There are, but it requires a multifaceted approach. It's not a quick fix. One key area is monetary policy, which is essentially how central banks manage the money supply and interest rates.
So going back to your concert ticket analogy, it's like the central bank is trying to make sure there aren't suddenly millions of extra dollars flooding the market and driving up the price of those tickets.
That's a great way to put it. They need to strike a balance between stimulating economic growth and keeping inflation in check. But it's a delicate dance, and there's always a risk of going too far in either direction.
What about fiscal policy? How does government spending and taxation come into play?
Fiscal policy can definitely play a role. When governments run large budget deficits, meaning they're spending more than they're taking in through taxes, it can contribute to inflationary pressures. It's like adding fuel to the fire.
So if inflation is a concern, governments might need to tighten their belts a bit and reduce spending or increase taxes to cool things down.
Exactly. But of course, those decisions often involve trade-offs and can be politically difficult. Nobody likes to see their taxes go up or their government programs get cut.
It's like trying to find the sweet spot between supporting economic growth and keeping inflation under control. It sounds like there's no easy answer.
There isn't. It requires careful analysis, a long-term perspective, and a willingness to make tough choices. But beyond monetary and fiscal policy, there are also structural reforms that can help create a more resilient and equitable economy.
Can you give some examples of what those reforms might look like?
Absolutely. One area is deregulation, which can reduce barriers to entry for new businesses and foster competition. When markets are more competitive, it tends to keep prices in check and drive innovation.
So it's about creating an environment where businesses have to constantly strive to improve and offer better products and services at competitive prices.
Exactly, and that benefits consumers in the long run. Another important area is investing in education and training. By equipping workers with the skills they need to succeed in a changing economy, we can help boost productivity and wages, making people less vulnerable to the erosive effects of inflation.
So it's about giving people the tools they need to not just survive, but thrive in a dynamic economic landscape.
Precisely. And finally, tax policies that encourage investment and entrepreneurship can be a powerful tool. By creating incentives for businesses to grow and create jobs, we can foster a more robust and dynamic economy that's better equipped to weather inflationary storms.
So it's about creating a virtuous cycle where economic growth and opportunity can help counteract the negative impacts of inflation.
That's a great way to put it. And it's a reminder that while inflation presents real challenges, it's not an insurmountable problem. With thoughtful policies and a focus on long-term solutions, we can navigate these complexities and create a more stable and equitable future.
Those are some really valuable insights. It's clear that inflation is a multifaceted issue with far-reaching consequences, but it's also something we can address proactively through smart policies and a deeper understanding of its underlying causes.
Absolutely, and that's a message worth emphasizing. Inflation isn't just a fact of life that we have to accept passively. We have the power to influence its trajectory and shape its impact on our lives.
And on that empowering note, we're going to take a quick break, but don't go anywhere, because when we come back, we'll continue our exploration of inflation, looking at some real-world examples and discussing what you can do to protect yourself and your finances in an inflationary environment. Welcome back to Phoenix Podcast, hosted by Amin Moeinian. We're deep in our exploration of inflation, and before the break, we were talking about how it's not just a numbers game, it's about real-life impacts on people, businesses, and the whole economy.
Yes, and we were discussing some of the tools governments can use to try to manage inflation, like those delicate adjustments to money supply and interest rates.
Right. And we were also talking about the need for long-term solutions, like encouraging competition and equipping people with the skills they need to thrive. But let's get even more concrete. What does this actually look like in the real world? What are some tangible examples of how inflation is affecting people's lives?
Well, let's take the example of housing. In many parts of the world, housing prices have been skyrocketing. For someone trying to buy their first home, rising inflation coupled with those high prices can make that dream feel increasingly out of reach.
It's like that classic game of keep away, but with a place to live.
Exactly. And even for those who already own homes, inflation can still have a big impact. Think about rising property taxes or the increasing cost of home repairs. Suddenly, maintaining that home becomes a much bigger financial burden.
So it's not just about getting it to the market, it's about staying afloat once you're there.
Absolutely. And these challenges aren't limited to housing. Think about everyday expenses like groceries and transportation. Those costs have been steadily climbing, making it harder for families to make ends meet, especially those on tight budgets.
It's like that feeling of running on a treadmill. You're working hard, but the ground keeps shifting beneath your feet.
That's a great analogy. And this brings us to a point that Amin Moeinian has been emphasizing. He talks about how inflation can act like a hidden tax, eroding purchasing power and making it harder for people to maintain their standard of living.
So it's not just about seeing a bigger number on your grocery bill. It's about the fact that your money doesn't go as far as it used to.
Exactly. And this is where it becomes really important to understand how inflation can impact your personal finances. It's not just about governments and big economic forces. It's about what you can do to protect yourself and your family.
So let's talk about that. What are some practical steps people can take to navigate an inflationary environment?
One important strategy is to make sure your income is keeping pace with inflation. That might mean negotiating a raise, looking for a higher-paying job, or finding ways to supplement your income.
So don't be afraid to ask for what you're worth and explore different income streams.
Exactly, and this is a point where understanding the principles of classical liberalism can be helpful. It emphasizes the importance of individual initiative and the freedom to pursue economic opportunities.
So taking ownership of your financial well-being not just waiting for things to get better. What else can people do?
Another key strategy is to manage debt carefully. High-interest debt like credit cards can become a real burden during inflationary periods because the interest rates are constantly adjusting upwards. It's like trying to outrun a rising tide.
So maybe consider consolidating debt, finding lower interest rates, or even exploring debt reduction strategies.
Exactly. And finally, consider how you're investing your savings. During inflationary periods, it's essential to make sure your money is working for you, not losing value.
So maybe look beyond traditional savings accounts which might not be keeping up with inflation.
Exactly. Explore options that offer a potential hedge against inflation, like investments in real estate or commodities, or even something like Treasury inflation-protected securities,
Yeah.
TIPS, which are designed to keep pace with rising prices.
This is where it gets really interesting because it's about understanding the tools available and finding the strategies that align with your individual goals and risk tolerance.
Absolutely. It's about being proactive, informed, and taking control of your financial future.
I think that's a really empowering message. While inflation presents challenges, it also highlights the importance of financial literacy and taking ownership of your financial well-being.
I couldn't agree more.
Well, I think this has been a really insightful deep dive into inflation. We've gone beyond just looking at rising prices. We've explored how it can redistribute wealth and impact everything from individual opportunities to economic growth.
We've also talked about some of the policy levers that governments can use, but I think what's really important is that we've empowered listeners with some concrete steps they can take to navigate this complex landscape.
Exactly. It's not about panicking. It's about understanding the forces at play, making informed decisions, and taking control of your financial well-being. And to our listeners out there, I think the key takeaway is that knowledge is power. By understanding the dynamics of inflation, you're better equipped to make choices that align with your personal goals and values. Thanks for tuning in.